All right. Good morning and welcome to STL History Live, Three Flags Day. Colonial St. Louis women, or actually lives on the edge, women in Colonial St. Louis, a little bit of a title change. My name is Aaron Pelker. I'm a community engagement coordinator with the Missouri Historical Society, and I want to thank you for spending part of your Tuesday morning with us. Today's program is presented in conjunction with the museum's current exhibit, Beyond the Ballot, which is open now through June 2022, and is also part of a statewide initiative honoring Missouri's bicentennial, commemorating 200 years of history. We'll have more bicentennial related programming throughout the spring and summer, so look out for that. I also want to thank both the Zoo Museum Tax District and our museum members. Without your generous support, we wouldn't be able to host programs like this morning's. Next, I do want to mention that both the Missouri History Museum in Forest Park and the Soldiers Memorial Military Museum downtown are open to the public. Your safety is a top priority, and we would love for you to visit us if you feel comfortable doing so. Advanced free reservations are required and are available at mohistory.org. Lastly, before we get to this morning's presentation, I want to mention a couple of the features on Zoom you may find helpful. Closed captioning is available. To turn it on, click the closed captioning button on your Zoom toolbar. You can also submit questions for our speaker at any time through the Q&A dialog box on the Zoom toolbar. We'll do our best, but we may not have time at the end to answer every question. This morning's presentation is also being recorded, and it will be available on the Missouri Historical Society's YouTube channel in the coming days. Last, your feedback is always important to us, and we would really appreciate it if you could complete a short survey that will automatically open in your internet browser. So please be on the lookout for that. With that, I do want to turn it over to Amanda Clark, Community Tours Manager at the Missouri Historical Society. So enjoy the program, everyone.
Thank you, Aaron. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. This is one of the talks I've been most excited about giving for a long time. I've landed in one of those great career spots that I get to dive into lots of topics when I give these talks. And this one, and I give talks on everything from the history of graffiti to tornadoes to riverfront geology last week. All things I love and love getting to learn about. This particular talk is inspired by the 217th anniversary of last week. Well, not the 217th anniversary of last week, but last week we had the 217th anniversary of Three Flags Day here in St. Louis. And that's the day that St. Louis officially passed into the hands of the American government. And that whole Louisiana Purchase handover thing, that all gets kind of overshadowed a lot by Lewis and Clark, right? That's a great big story. But there's other aspects of that story that you can pull out that show the incredible impact on the lives of colonial St. Louisans that changeover had, and none more than the women living here at the time. Like Aaron said, I am the community tours manager here, which means that when I'm not giving talks like this, you can find me somewhere out in St. Louis, walking with groups of people all over St. Louis in different neighborhoods. And we have several tours every single week. And in the weekends, we are full walking all around with lots of new tours coming up, including the Hill neighborhood, Tower Grove South neighborhood, and a new downtown tour that will focus on the western portion of downtown. So to get to Lives on the Edge. So first once we get started, I'm going to provide context first. And I promise to kind of, be succinct and wrap, the story of the Louisiana Purchase. I promise to be a little more interesting than you may remember in the 5th grade. But then we're going to explore the lives of several different women, each in different circumstances that kind of embody the experiences of women, throughout this period. If you have questions as we go along, I am happy to check the Q&A, and then at the end we will have dedicated Q&A time as well. Let's go. First, to set up the story. So, and this amazingly confusing map shows Louisiana territory. For to set up the story, we need to succinctly address just how and why Three Flags Day happened. Let's do Three Flags first. And first, And before I do any of that, I want to fully acknowledge that when I use any of these terms in regards to government during the colonial era, I do so with the understanding that these were the lands belonging to several Native American tribes. And the land where St. Louis now exists is the ancestral home to the Osage Nation, the Missouri, and the Illini Confederacy. And just like those living here now with French, African, Anglo, or Spanish heritage, there's still large numbers of American Indians living in Missouri. St. Louis was founded in 1764, right, by a group of French merchants looking for a great spot for a trading post. And they found it, sitting up on top of a 30-foot tall bluff, protected from the Mississippi's floodwaters, and backed by an even higher plateau that would allow for safety and protection from attack. In the meantime, as they would soon find out, France had ceded all the land west of Mississippi to Spain and east to Britain. So they had accidentally picked a very precarious spot as well. And they're now staring right across the river at a territory under new control and influenced by very different social norms. In some ways, this helps the village grow because when you have that French territory on the east side of the river, when they find out the British are coming, a lot of them leave and come over to St. Louis and help populate the village and help it grow. A lot of them actually go to New Orleans as well. So there's a split off of people. And you have people populating the village from all over and with lots of different circumstances. The village is inhabited by Creole French, Canadian French, enslaved Africans, free Africans, enslaved American Indians, and free Indians. And women, white, Black, and American Indian, come to St. Louis either with their merchant husbands or fathers or as enslaved people. Those are the most common ways that they make their way here. And all of these women come from different gender norms, right? They have different situations in their home cultures. And because of St. Louis's unique geography and history, all that comes together to create a society where all of these women have unique power and unique agency in far greater numbers than women do in the East Coast and the other territories. And you can imagine how they're enjoying all of this, more freedom and more agency. How when in 1804, when the Americans take over, it must have been a very uncertain time for them, and they didn't know, things were changing quickly. So in 1802, so first we think we're French, but actually we're Spanish, and the Spanish and the French, the Spanish are in control for a good 30-something years, while French culture is ruling the day. In 1802, though, Napoleon Bonaparte forces Spain to hand Louisiana back to France in a secret treaty. Again, with St. Louis sitting right on the edge between the empires. And then not very long after, like just a year later, the famous Louisiana Purchase happens, and France sells to the Americans, putting St. Louis now as the gateway to the new American territory. An interesting point that for some reason always kind of illustrates the timing and some of the reality of this to me is the fact that when Lewis and Clark come to St. Louis, they actually needed French interpreters to speak with Auguste Chouteau and the other village leaders. It's something that kind of puts it all into perspective for me. So Three Flags Day, and that's what this painting here illustrates, is Three Flags Day in St. Louis. And this happens in 1804. In 1803, when everything first happens in New Orleans, they have a huge ceremony, but this is what we have here in St. Louis. So Three Flags Day is a multi-part, couple-of-day event that is both symbolic and the bureaucratic culmination of Louisiana Purchase. It's held on March 9th, 1804, just under a year since that initial purchase happened. And because of, Louisiana territory is so huge, and Spain's still pretty much running all of it. So we only had a year of this changeover. There's suddenly a need to play catch up in St. Louis. It's a pretty strange 24 hours. So Louisiana Purchase goes through in 1803 in April, which is hundreds of millions of acres of land. It takes months for them to get the arrangements finalized. Throughout the summer and fall of 1803, Congress has got to sign papers, money has to change hands, they have a big ceremony in New Orleans, and that gets things going. But because this is winter and it's the 1800s, the people living up in the northern parts of the territory have no idea any of this is happening. And they hadn't gotten word of any of it. So in March of 1804, it's decided there should be another official ceremony wrapping it all up in St. Louis. There's a small problem with that. St. Louis is one of the cities that the Spanish hadn't gotten around to giving up yet. So they have to do it very quickly, but officially. So the land has to be officially transferred from Spain to France, and then it has to come back to France, and then France to the United States. All this happens within 24 hours, again, bureaucratically. First, they post a notice on the city church, and then the next day they sign the first treaty. They take down the Spanish flag, they raise the French flag, and that was supposed to come down 6 hours later. However, they kept it up. The town ends up staying up all night partying, singing French songs, and then at noon the next day, they signed the last treaty. And actually, the man that was representing France and America is the same person, so he could have, he could have shaken his own hand. But they switch it to the American flag. It's kind of an anticlimactic moment. No one in the crowd is cheering and very excited about this moment. So to reiterate, we are discussing the period from the mid-1760s to the years following the Louisiana Purchase being finalized. So the transition from French trading post ruled by Spain, interacting with native cultures, to a newly American city grasping with rapid growth and change under a government that's powered by manifest destiny. And from the beginning, the village of St. Louis was special. It dealt with normal frontier problems. There was a lack of food at certain times, big weather events, there were attacks, things like that. But because of the fluidity of government and all these changes from French to Spanish to French, and the influx of all of these cultures, the villagers actually developed somewhat uncommon views of women for the time. And those views are reflected in how women came to be here, how they spent their days, how did they appear in the legal records, and how much control they had over their own lives. Because they lived in a diverse borderland settlement, they could make up their own rules a lot of times. And that ends up what happened. That is what ends up happening here in St. Louis. This is an early map, very earliest village of St. Louis, which was that fort up on the plateau that I talked about, and then the riverfront bluff down there at the bottom. And these images here, they tend to show up in any documents about, any modern research or documents and stories, articles about colonial St. Louis, because they were drawn by a colonial era female artist in St. Louis, a woman by the name of Anna Maria von Pfull. And I'm going to use them as the backdrop for setting up the story of women in colonial St. Louis. First, in the early days of the village, men outnumbered women 5-1. And just 30 years later, in 1794, that had fell to 2-1. And because the economy here was based on trade and merchandise, and not agriculture, and so much so, and on a note about the merchandise sentence about trade and merchandise, it was so based on that weaving in the when you take women's work, in the home, usually weaving, making cloths, things like that, that was illegal here because they wanted people to need to buy cloth and buy materials like that. So, everything's based on trade and merchandise and not agriculture. Agriculture is just to survive, right? So free women, mostly Creole, were more likely to be the wives and daughters of merchants, traders, and craftsmen, not farmers. Women normally married quite young to men much older. They usually could have married several times. They were constantly pregnant, and the infant mortality rate was about 30%. Almost half of the colonial population was white, with the rest being free and enslaved Indians, Africans, and those of mixed races. Some female slaves worked the common field, farming for the village, but most other women's lives centered on village life. And that's pretty normal for any French village, right? Everyone lives together and they farm separately. And during this time of town building, women's ability to make homes and make babies to fill them was essential, right? Women of all levels. So women of all statuses and economic levels had a lot in common. And their domestic work, while they may have had larger homes or more tools or more people to help, it all looked very similar in many ways. Unlike the 19th century, race was not the main determinant of status either. Black slaves had the fewest legal rights, but free people of all races had almost all the same legal rights. The only delineations were social and economic status. So free women in a Creole society, in comparison to those on the East Coast, had many more options when it came to property rights and financial mobility. When they married, They signed marriage contracts that detailed what assets both the husband and the wife brought into the marriage. And the wife could inherit all of the marital property when her husband died. If they had children that were of age, that would be split between 50% to her, the rest to them. But if they had no children, or if the children were, were young, all of that property went to the wife. So women could take wealth with them, right? And they could take it with them, and they could keep it. When both parents died, sons and daughters inherited equally. This is totally the opposite of what is happening in English-based territories. And this was part of the French laws. This is part of the system, the law system in France. That's why that gets brought here. And the Spanish allows most of that to maintain culturally. Within a marriage, the husband did hold legal control over his wife, but financially and all that, women had options if they were left to be on their own. In the English colonies, laws heavily favored men and male heirs, and women were most often completely silent when it comes to property and legal status. Free women in St. Louis had the ability to be financially independent and have their own economic resources. All widows that were free had greater freedom and more control over their lives than did married women, and wealthy widows enjoyed the highest social status. Culturally, French women had more general independence and were seen as more valuable members of society. The first US civil commander, the guy that could have shaken his own hand, Amos Stoddard, when he takes over after Three Flags, he's writing a few years later about French women in comparison. And he says, quote, "The women have more influence over their husbands than is common in most other countries. Perhaps this arises in part from the example of the parent state, in part from the respect which the men entertain for their wives, and perhaps still more because of the exclusive right which the women have to the property in consequences of marriage contracts. Even in most instances of purchases and sales, the women are consulted and frequently assume management of property." And this is standard all up and down the Mississippi River. This is found in St. Genevieve and in St. Louis and other areas. Now that's applying to free women, right? For enslaved women, and I'm using this image, it's from the Arch Museum. It's just a great kind of an image of daily life here in St. Louis. With lots of different kind of people standing around talking, so using that as a backdrop. For enslaved women, of course, life was very different, and the coming of American rule had very big impact. In colonial St. Louis, enslavement of Africans was governed by what was known as the Code Noir, the French slave law. And even when things switch over to Spanish rule, the actual rules stay pretty much the same. And the big difference, which I'll discuss in a minute, comes to whether they're African slaves or Indian slaves. Enslavement was here from the beginning. In 1766, the village's first census shows that the village of over 350 included about 22% of its population as slaves, both African and American Indian. Under Spanish law, American Indians were not allowed to be enslaved, and the fact that there were a large amount of them here in St. Louis shows how little the Spanish were able to exert legal control over cultural norms. The majority of the Indian slaves were women, though, since they were often taken as prisoners after battles and conflicts and sold. In St. Louis, while they followed the Code Noir technically, there were a few things that were softened. Slaves were baptized and buried in consecrated ground. Kids were not sold away from their parents. People were encouraged to be legitimately married. And it's important to note that while the Code Noir is an enslavement law, and that that is the rule there, it is more responsive to the humanity of the enslaved than the laws that would take hold once Americans took over. During the colonial period, enslaved people could gain freedom in three ways. They could get notarized agreements, which means their owner could get, manumission that could give them their freedom. They could be given their freedom in their owner's wills when their owner passes away. And then later, and this is when, this is only under Spanish rule, later they can purchase themselves. For women, these things often came about because of children they had with their owners, and because of the nature of those relationships. And that is where things get very murky, right? And it doesn't even have to be, a relationship with their owners. Sometimes they may have children with an owner's brother. And this, things get very murky. Indian and Black women who were free were more immediately able to take part in legal proceedings. Like as soon as they were free, they had the same rights as other free women did. And there's one example of a Black woman named Marguerite, who once she is freed, she marries a hunter, she marries a free man. The two of them move back in with their former owner. They take care of him until he dies, and they inherit all of his assets. In the legal record, she represents herself within under a year of being married. So she's already out there, affecting her life and for the better. And interestingly, the Code Noir forbid free Blacks from inheriting from whites, and it isn't clear whether that applied to Indians. So now I'm going to go through, we've got kind of all that not settled. There's so much to that. Again, I could do hours of talking about the nuances of all of those different things. But I am going to highlight a few women whose experiences can serve as examples, but also as exceptions, right? So the first one I'm going to discuss is a very serious lady, and she's an example of upward mobility and potential for independence that free Creole women had. And so this is Marie Chouteau, or Madame Chouteau, as we will call her, and her life would make for a great movie someday. Hopefully somebody will pick that up. She makes for a complex, imperfect character. She follows her heart. She refuses to accept circumstances as they are, and she creates a life of her own that shapes our country's history. So for Marie Chouteau, for her last 50 years, she lives in the very center of St. Louis. She's in one of the village's largest homes. She enjoys the highest social status. She trades in furs. She owns a plantation. She owned properties throughout the area, as well as several slaves, both African and Indian. But before all that, she was an abandoned single mother living in colonial New Orleans. Marie is born in 1773 in New Orleans and married when she was 15. And she was married for about a year, and a year that includes evidence of abuse. And in that year, she had a baby, Auguste Chouteau, with her husband, Rene. Then they separate. Her and her husband separate. In 1752, he leaves the two of them in New Orleans and returns to France. And not too long after that, Marie she does two very big things. One, she starts calling herself Veuve Chouteau, or the widow Chouteau. And here she's taking direct advantage of those French laws pertaining to social status and financial agency of widows, even though she isn't one. She's taking it, she's working it, right? She also meets Pierre Laclede, a Frenchman around her age, who's, despite the fact they can't legally get married, they not only start a family of their own, they have 4 children, but they baptize all of them as her absent husbands, so that her status as widow is protected. And this says a lot about the fluidity of government and who knows what's going on, and being able to take control of your own destiny. Once she settles with Pierre in St. Louis, she begins amassing property of her own with his help and enjoys the highest social status because of her familial connections with him, although still being called a widow. When her legal husband, Rene, shows back up in 1767, this is just 3 years after the village is founded, he shows up in 1767, and by that time, her status is high enough that she's able to convince the Spanish lieutenant governor that she's effectually an independent widow, and he agrees to it, despite her husband standing right there. When Rene does eventually actually die, which means she could legally marry Laclede, she doesn't. By that time, he had amassed a lot of debt in building the village, and he would have brought that to the marriage. When he dies, all that dies with him, and she's left completely financially independent. Of course, this financial independence is in part because of the work of her enslaved workers, both on the plantation, working the farm, working the fields, and working in her home. When she dies in 1814, she has 50 grandchildren living within a mile of her home, and all of her children had married into wealthy merchant families. Her sons had French wives as well as Indian wives in powerful families. I mean, they had created this network of wealth and power throughout the area. So we're gonna go from her. This next woman I'm gonna highlight is Esther, and she represents the experience of a former slave given their freedom through sign off, and how that freedom was then used to gain agency. So it was not uncommon for women of color to own property in colonial St. Louis, and many of them were formerly enslaved or the daughters of slaves. There are several reasons for this, in opposition to the experiences of women in British and American territories. First, the Spanish were eager to settle the land, so they granted land regardless of race or sex. Society, being as mixed racially as it was more tolerant than that of the Eastern areas. And for these women, the ability to own property offered stability and collateral. They could bring income in by farming the land, they could host boarders, they could take in laundry, and it raised their social status as well. In colonial St. Louis, owning a lot in the village also meant you had a right to a piece of the common fields to be used, for farming. For Black women, who were more experienced than most women of the merchant class with farming, this gave them extra opportunity. And some were even able to create large farms, add to their holdings in the common fields and bring in income of their own. And even though this scenario isn't uncommon, it wasn't the norm. Because a lot of property wasn't officially recorded. When the Americans took over, many of these women had challenges to face in keeping that ownership. And there are records of several Black women holding impressive amounts of real estate within the village. But for the most part, African-American women in colonial St. Louis were poor, they did not have property, and they were most likely enslaved. The free women of color were part of an elite social status, for sure. So the document here, which is in French, is a record of the timeline of a woman named Esther Clay Morgan. And Esther is considered to be one of the most successful of the women of color who were property owners. She was born a slave, but she was purchased to settle a debt by Jacques Clay Morgan. And Jacques is a figure that deserves his own presentation on another day. She became Clay Morgan's mistress, a romantic partner, and a business partner of sorts. And he was a man with massive land holdings, numerous business ventures all over the territory, not just in St. Louis. He had mines, he had all kinds of stuff. And when he was not in St. Louis, she was in complete control of the home and the business matters being taken care of here. In 1793, Clay Morgan decides to protect a chunk of his assets in real estate by giving Esther her freedom and then putting a bunch of real estate in her name and signing it over to her, which included an entire city block in today's Laclede's Landing. He then sold Esther her own daughter and took care of Esther's grandson financially. Eventually, though, Jacques begins having pretty public romantic affairs, and Esther begins to look at how she needs to protect herself legally. So she decides to leave him. And when she leaves him, actually before she leaves him, when she's noticing what's going on, she stops signing things. She's illiterate. She cannot read what he's putting in front of her, although she knows their land deeds. She refuses to sign anything after a certain point. And then when she leaves, she takes the deeds with her that have her mark on them. And he claims he was just using her to protect this property, but she says, "These are mine. You've got my mark on them. This is my land." And the Spanish government upholds her right to the properties when Clay Morgan tries to get them back. However, when the Americans take over, Clay Morgan is able to take advantage of the legal changes and the new leaders and the upheaval. And the Americans do not uphold her property rights in the same way that the Spanish did. The Americans, as they were sorting through all of this new territory, they require proof of 10 years of ownership to certify any Spanish land claims. Clay Morgan forges his needed documents to get the land back. He threatens to take back possession of her daughter by altering the papers that were related to her purchase. Esther fights Clay Morgan in court for 29 years until her death. She does not give up, this thing that has happened. And in the end, she was able to hold on to her home. In the end, even though the Americans would not honor most of the land holdings, land claims she had, she was able to hold on to her home and one of the large real estate tracts. And it was large enough that when she died, her descendants made a $10,000 profit on that land, which was pretty substantial at the time. So I'm going to check the Q&A real quick, and a great question. Thank you, Sue. Hi, Sue. Do we know where Madame Chateau's home was located? Yes, it was located right in the middle, underneath the arch. So basically just the arch and just a few feet west, right behind the old cathedral. There's a marker there showing her house and where it was located. And she is buried, she's buried, I think, at Calvary Cemetery. It's where the Chateaus are. She was originally buried in the old cathedral churchyard and then moved to Calvary later. So after Esther, let me move on to our next scenario. And this kind of brings a lot of this stuff together that I've discussed. And this is the story of the Scipion sisters. And I use this image because the Scipion sisters' mother, Marie, lived in the home of Pierre Chateau. And he factors in heavily in their lives. And this, is his residence in St. Louis. So Celeste and Katish Scipion were enslaved Indian African women. Their mother, Marie Jean Scipion, was a Natchez Indian woman who had been enslaved under French power. And as I said earlier, Indian slaves were not allowed under Spanish rule, but people found their way around this. Marie's daughters were sold away from her, despite that also not being the rule of law. Her owner sold them to his own daughters, and eventually they ended up all together again in Pierre Chateau's house, although he was not their owner. In 1799, their owner attempted to sell them, the daughters, but his own daughters fought this, saying the two girls had been gifts, and since they were Indian, they couldn't be sold. So the two daughters are really just wanting to keep their good house help. They don't really have any big noble cause here, but they use that fact that they have, that their mother was an Indian, they use that to their own advantage in keeping them. So once the Americans take over, their owner, a man by the last name of Teon, he tries to sell them again, but his daughters fight it, and they're just trying to keep their own house help. But they did testify in court on the women's behalf. So he backs away from it then. After the American takeover is final and things are starting, the court system is in place, the two sisters, the daughters, they sue their owner under the argument that since they were Indian, they were being held illegally because their mother had been enslaved during the French and Spanish regimes. And while she was legally a slave under the French, she should have been freed under the Spanish. And Teon's daughter's testimony helps in many ways. It gives evidence confirming their free status. And the fact that the Teon women were white and they were testifying in court in support of a Black woman, that also helps because territorial law considers a Black person's testimony against a white person invalid. So the women could not testify on their own. The initial judges agree with them and free them. They don't agree with them on moral standards. These were men that were slaveholders themselves, but they understood that they had a good point. The territorial law wasn't clear as to what they should do. So they give them their freedom. However, former owners did not appreciate this and fight right back in court, which eventually places them back in slavery. 20 years later, in 1824, new laws become more formalized and make it possible for them to bring their claims up again. After several appeals, they were eventually given their freedom. And their example is one that sets later enslaved people to use freedom suits as a way to leave enslavement, which could be a direct line, to Harriet Scott's case just a few years later. So I hope that was quick, right? There's so much more we could talk about, but I hope my talk today has helped shed some light on how the changing governments, geographic location, and the mixing of cultures affected women's experiences during the last part of the 18th century in St. Louis. And even though the Americans came and then the large waves of immigrants to St. Louis in the 19th century, I like to think that the independence and spirits of those early St. Louis women were what was woven into the DNA of our region. I'm now happy to take any Q&A and also to please encourage everyone to fill out the survey at the end. Your feedback is really, really helpful and important to me. And you can also email me and I'll put this in the chat. My email is aclark at mohistory.org. If you would like a list of resources that I used in creating this, as well as things that you can read for further study, because there's lots of good stuff out there to read. So I will put my email in the chat. I also invite everybody on the CSTL walking tours. They'll be happening every week from here until next February when it gets cold, and we'll still be doing it. And now you're welcome to add anything to the Q&A. You're welcome. Thank you. Kevin says, thank you. Very interesting. I appreciate that. Question in the chat. If there are no more questions, or if we have no more questions or comments, again, I really welcome you to email me with any questions or thoughts that you might have. And yeah, hope to see you somewhere out in St. Louis walking around.
Thanks again to Amanda. I'm going to share just a quick slide here. And I want to say thanks to Amanda again, and a big thanks to everyone who tuned in this morning. We have our regularly scheduled STL History Live programs on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. and Thursdays at 6:30 p.m., as well as Soldiers Memorial Challenge chats on select Wednesdays at noon. You can see a couple of the upcoming programs on this slide, and you can find links for all our upcoming programs at mohistory.org or on the Missouri History Museum Facebook page. So please be sure to check out that lineup. And as Amanda mentioned, please don't forget to fill out those surveys also. So thank you again, and we'll see you next time. Have a good day, everyone.